we need to shift from outputs to outcomes. And rethinking outcomes is a fundamentally different task. It's a complicated task as well because you got to go through a lot of political battle to get there. I'll give you an example of how I've been thinking about it. I've been having this sparring with a good friend of mine. Payroll systems, as we know it, pay you bi-weekly or monthly or semi-monthly. But there are those emails that you potentially get from your manager for basically doing that diving cash, solving that customer problem, and you did a phenomenal job. Put time until like 3 o'clock in the morning to get it out of the way, right? Kudos. Do you get specifically incentivized for it? Probably not, right? So yeah, I think there's got to be some instant karma that needs to come through. And then if you start thinking about how do you keep your employees engaged so they're heavily outcome driven, but make sure that they are sustained in your organization, so you don't want to have bad practices where someone starts doing things in a way that's not in the best interest of the organization, and you don't want to basically tank your profits. So I think there are some guardrails that you still have to put in place, but I think you have to rethink what is it that you're actually solving for. Well, people are getting paid for a reason, and people are getting paid for outcomes, not for outputs anymore. And I think if you start taking that kind of a notion, I think AI can truly help you get there. But you got to go through steps 1 and 2 first.
So if humans need to start thinking not outputs, but outcomes, I suspect agents do too. But why do you think that outcome-based pricing isn't a good idea? Yeah, Harish, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Don. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, super excited to have you on the podcast. Actually, there's a lot to talk about. I know we got connected in a security industry community. I saw that you had a really interesting background and we had some fun conversation around AI. Before we jump into the topic, which is proof of value or PoV, and we'll explain obviously what that means for the audience. Take a few minutes, tell the audience about your background and obviously, how you got into the industry and how that all kind of ties together. We'll start on the line of questioning after.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much. As you probably saw, I just joined a company by the name Harting, and I'm actually thrilled to be there because I just joined as a director of AI solutions, and I will be leading the end-to-end capability of enabling AI within the organization. So I'm super excited about it. We'll talk a little bit more about the company at a later point in time, but before I was with Harting, I guess my career through line, if you were to call it, was basically built around the intersection of products, automation. Those were like the two big things that I was always interested in, and innovation. And I think I've learned, especially given that I was with Motorola Solutions for a long time, I've seen people use our devices. One of the key things that I always start with is what are the jobs that we are solving for? It's a question than an answer. And how do you shape that clear path from an idea to an outcome is probably what I look for. And that's something that I've carried over across my entire career, I would say. As you know, I was with Motorola Solutions for about 15 years. I was an engineer at some point in time, and then I moved into product management, product strategy, built some phenomenal capabilities over there that I'm very proud of. And that's actually how I got connected with Lee and then to you eventually. But my last role was with Accenture. I was the Gen AI industry lead for the high-tech practice. And one of the key things that I was proud about was being at the intersection of AI, business strategy, and products, which is a way of saying, let's make sure that we build AI that's practical and meaningful, and then scale it from there. And that's what I'm excited about. And we'll be talking about a lot of topics over here today. I know proof of value being that favorite topic, but I can pause here. Happy to answer more questions about me.
Yeah. Man, head of Gen AI at Accenture. I mean, in strategy, you must have had a lot of fun in that time frame of all the hype and things that have been happening. And I'm sure you were there before it was cool.
Oh, it was amazing.
You were dealing with Gen AI before it was cool, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was there in 2021. I was fortunate to start with some AI capabilities even before ChatGPT came along. And I think it was just basically a watershed moment that when ChatGPT happened, it was a very important thing that Accenture decided to do, which was to have an industry practice and drive an industry narrative around AI from an enterprise standpoint. So I've loved my career at Accenture. I couldn't be more blessed.
That's awesome. Well, we're glad to have you in the industry. I think when we connected in planning for this, I was super excited to meet with you because I don't meet a lot of people. But yes, they're usually kept in closed and confined doors and product development and engineering teams. And I'd love to see you out and about in the community and meeting with people, talking about what's happening with AI and bringing awareness from a practitioner standpoint. So I just want to say thank you. And we need more people like you. Uh, so then let's talk about this whole thing around proof of value. When we were discussing the topic, one of the things that I've always found interesting around AI is how do you bridge the gap between demos to production? And in the space that I'm in, that can be a very wide gap. And a lot of companies did a lot of experimentation, but maybe few or the few knowledgeable ones knew how to get into live production to get some real return, or in this case, value. And so when people in security hear about this proof of value concept for AI, like what did they usually get wrong right out of the gate about this topic?
Yeah, great question. And it's a fantastic starting point. I believe people still get caught up with what I call a proof of concept and they assume that it's a proof of value by in itself. A POC just proves that the math works. What I mean by that is you basically take some data, put it through, and then you get some answers and you say, voila, it looks great. A proof of value, on the other hand, starts with a hypothesis of value, which means that there is a way to connect the technical metrics like precision and accuracy and recall to things that matter to the business. Model accuracy to business outcomes is how I would probably say it. The question then is not, does it work? You have to reframe that question around, are we designing the right experiments to prove that the value is good enough for production? And more importantly, where should it absolutely not be implemented? You will get into a lot of situations where you will see that AI, being a probabilistic model, has a tendency to work better in certain areas and not so much in others. It's a matter of figuring out where it actually works and then implement it over there and then ensure that the gaps are solved for by humans.
Now, when you use the term probabilistic, can we use non-determinism interchangeably, or how would you say they're different? And you can also define these for the audience so they kind of understand what that means.
Yeah, well, let's maybe just take a quick step back and talk about what non-determinism is versus probability. They are related to each other, and one feeds the other. Non-determinism, if you think about your entire gamut of where we started several years back with traditional systems like ERPs and CRMs, input, black box, output. Given the same input, you always get the same output. Correct. Now, if you take a traditional machine learning model that you've trained with a certain data set and you've tested with another, typically that tends to be true as well. And it is a probabilistic model, but it tends to be somewhat deterministic in terms of the inputs that you provide. When you take generative AI, you realize that it's not just taking an input, it also has the ability to author new output. And the output that it generates can vary probabilistically from one time to another. Now you take that and put it through an agentic orchestration model, and suddenly you see yourself, you would have gone through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and agentic orchestration has the ability to say, I don't need to execute steps 3 and 4. I can go 1 through 5 directly. Now that's non-determinism. And non-determinism happened because of probability that happened in prior steps where the data was coming through and was being construed in a certain way that got you to a certain result. Now, are there ways to minimize it? Yes. I think the bigger question is, should you? And should you be comfortable with non-determinism? So let's start there and see if the distinction between non-determinism and probabilities were clear.
Yeah. You raise a good question. Like, should people be comfortable with non-determinism, right? And not having control. And there are certain things where I feel like it's okay to not have control. Or I make a joke about this often where, sales and marketing was the first thing that these non-deterministic AIs were trying to target. At least it seemed that way by and large, and trying to automate those parts of those departments or roles or whatever. And maybe it's because in those kinds of roles, you can be wrong and still be okay. I'll say kind of wrong and still be okay, right? Like whether your marketing is embellishing a message to get a lead, or sales is trying to do something to get an appointment, but obviously now it's up to the sales engineer or maybe through the meeting to define scope so we can say exactly what it is. But there's some aspects where you can kind of be wrong, not manipulative, but still be okay and still function. And so So what I'm saying is like where I wonder when people can be comfortable with that. Like I don't know if you give that any thought that like I have with regards to that topic.
Reframe that slightly. Instead of calling it wrong, let's call it a range of outcomes. And let me give you an example over here. Again, I think about AI governance in the context of control systems because I come from an engineering background. That's probably why. And you brought up in a very interesting point of view around sales and marketing. Now, if you're thinking marketing and you're looking to build a message and you're trying to put it out, you might run your prompt once, you might get to a certain answer, and then it's created a certain message for you. You do it again, it creates a second message for you. That's different than the first one. Doesn't necessarily make it wrong. It's just that the words are different. Maybe you look at it and you say, well, it's just a choice that I have to pick. That's marketing. If you look at sales pricing, for example, you might run into a situation where you want to target a price of $10, for example. That's a traditional system. That's what you would do. Over here, you should be willing to accept a range. And you say, well, as long as it's between $9.50 and $10.50, should be okay. Now, if it goes outside that guardrail, then you want to potentially look at it and you want to ask yourself, do I have to do anything about it? And you ought to be able to. In fact, I was just having this conversation with one of my colleagues. She just joined as well, and I was saying I think reversibility is an important topic. If you inadvertently send out a million $1 coupons of an item that normally sells for $200, that's a huge problem. You got to be able to take that back, and it's happened before. We know that, and we got to be able to solve. So I think some reversibility is important, and the explainability of why did you get to that answer tends to be very important. Right? In some cases, it's a little bit more intangible, and it's okay in marketing. In coding, it tends to be intangible because I can ask for a code piece of code be written, and it probably create two just different versions of it, and that's okay. But I think where you have to take it back to is how are we governing the output? Are we looking at the right set of KPIs to ensure that the answers are coming out all right? So do you care that the code was different? Probably not until you realize that one of them was more performant than the other, or one of them had errors, the other did not. I think that's the way you have to start looking at outputs now. So non-determinism starts playing out in some very, very interesting ways. Sales and marketing is an important one. Customer service, on the other hand, that's probably why you didn't mention it. I can't go and tell a customer to troubleshoot a problem in 10 different ways. There's probably a specific logic associated with it, and those step-by-step instructions better be right every time. Otherwise, you're basically creating a bigger problem for yourself, right? So the blast radius of some of these things can potentially become much bigger. And that's how we have to start telling ourselves that it's okay as long as we have a range associated with things.
Yeah. So you did touch on briefly about the control system, right? So describing AI as a control system and not a static tool. And so how does thinking in terms of feedback loops change how we evaluate success here?
Great, great question. And so I think this has been done before. So we'll probably I'll give you my Netflix analogy, and I said this to a VP of e-commerce at that point in time, and it kind of resonated really well with them. I basically said Netflix has algorithms for each of you personalized, and it basically shows you a set of movies or shows that they believe you might be most interested in. And there are two potential problems associated with it. One is it might become a little too myopic and might not be giving you anything new to watch. You might actually end up thinking that's the entire ecosystem of the shows and movies that you can watch. And you might get bored. You might cancel. The second possible issue might be that your taste has changed over a period of time and you've drifted away from the recommendations that it was making. And hence, it has to now adjust itself to ensure that it's giving you the right recommendation. So if it's not doing it quickly enough, then that becomes a problem. If it's too fickle minded, that's a problem too, right? So eventually, you have to basically look at it from the perspective of saying feedback loops are important in the context of ensuring that I'm putting something in front of a user. It's a hypothesis of what I believe they might be interested in. I'm seeing them click through and then watch something or not watch something. I'm taking all that feedback in. I can improve my system and ensure that it's not drifting away, right? So, in other words, I think feedback loops, the whole concept of control systems are based on negative feedback, right? So, every click that happens to go wrong is a negative feedback that needs to go right back into the black box to ensure that it's giving you the right output the next time around.
I wonder how this is different from reinforcement learning. And what I've heard around reinforcement learning is we can, you could have AI systems that can um, do this in some aspects automatically for verifiable information, but then we need humans for unverifiable, let's say subjective feedback. Do you have any thoughts around, how reinforcement learning plays in here, and how do you scale reinforcement learning from a subjective standpoint? I know it's a little out of line of questioning, but I'm just super curious. Get your thoughts.
That's a very insightful question. I tend to think reinforcement learning and the concept that I just talked about in the context of Netflix are very related to each other. It's about ensuring that your system does not drift in a direction that you don't want it to. And sometimes a drift might be necessary because the human behavior is changing. The problem goes back to scale. And let's kind of take this back to a security example. You have body worn cameras picking up a lot of images and it's making certain real time decisions, let's say potentially. And the consequence of those decisions can be fatal potentially. And so if you start thinking about how do I collect that amount of data at scale and then use AI for AI, let's use that terminology for a moment, because being subjective is one thing. I think you got to be able to elevate some of these incidents that were very high escalation and then had a really bad outcome. You want to have a human reviewer and then provide some feedback to the system and then ensure that the system does not repeat those patterns again. But at the same time, you don't want a system that's acting on one off situations and then changing the entire methodology of how it works. But there is another model where you could say can understand what actually happened, what the outcomes were, what were you expecting the outcome to be versus what it actually turned out to be, and can it actually self correct itself? So I think that's probably a more scalable model, especially when you're starting to think about security and the number of events that happen and the answers that are coming back. I think that's a potential way to take this forward. Harish's views.
How far do you think we are from now? This is me not defining things for the audience. I apologize, but like, how far do you think we are from self recursive learning, like real self improving systems? And we could talk about it in terms of our industry. So, for example, I've heard from industry experts, and also it's my understanding that it's very rare that these systems learn, right? So, in the field. And so that people say, yeah, the more you use it, the better it gets. And I'm thinking, like, I don't think that's true. I mean, maybe in the next model run, right? But like, even by and large, if you use ChatGPT, it works great because it's grounded in your memory when you ask it something. So it can crawl that, and it makes it seem like it's getting better by use, but maybe it does for the next, instead of GPT 5.2 at 5.3, that run it'll improve. But the fact that it improves every single time I use it, and now in context of the security industry, how realistic is that?
It's not very realistic. We can say that. I mean, there are certain models that actually do improve based on certain questions. I'll give you an actual example. Way back when ChatGPT came along, ChatGPT 3 happened. I basically asked it a simple question about cricket. I said, "Tell me about the ball that's used in cricket," and it basically said that the ball was oval. It's spherical. It's not oval, obviously, and I don't know why it decided that it was oval. So I basically did say that a cricket ball is indeed spherical, it's not oval. And a few days later, I went back and tested that understanding again, and it actually now did respond back saying that a cricket ball is indeed spherical. So there are some simple things like that that it could probably, just because you categorically disagreed with it and then you sent back some information, it can learn from it. But you're talking about some very complex logic when it comes to public safety. You have a body worn camera, you have a device like a PTT that happened. There's a first responder situation that's going on. There's only and the workflow and the sequence of things that happen over there are considerably more complex for AI to actually figure out. Okay, I know exactly what happened. Now let's go back and the next time. I don't think that's realistic. I think this is probably where you're going to have to have a human in the loop and explain away, capture the information, send it back, and it can probably read those logs and then understand things a little better. But you're right. I think the as the frontier models go from 4 to 5 are probably like those big leaps that happen in learning. The micro learnings, it's just a term that I just coined, can happen in some scenarios, but they tend to be more simplistic scenarios, not the complex ones.
Right. And what I took from you is that we're in a complex industry.
We are in a very complex industry.
Yeah. I mean, video is one of the biggest data forms of data loss, right? Like the video never gets used.
Absolutely.
So, so let's talk a little bit about AI agents, right? So why is it dangerous to judge an AI agent based on a single output or one bad example?
Great question. The problem that you're going to have is, again, I'm going to go back into an analogy over here. It's basically called the law of small numbers. And if you basically go back to this whole notion of thinking fast and slow, phenomenal book, by the way, it basically talks about how people tend to look at certain incidents that become more apparent and then to believe that the system as a whole is behaving incorrectly. Autonomous cars are an example of something like that, where people tend to look at this one accident that happened in Arizona. Human would have averted that accident, and hence autonomous cars are bad. So it basically tends to get a bad rap, not realizing that there were probably a million incidents that it actually stopped from occurring in the first place, that a human would have absolutely crashed a vehicle. Autonomous car does not drink, it does not drive fast. There are so many things about it that are phenomenal, and it made this one mistake. Now, should you go back and understand why it happened and what could be done about it? Yes. Should you assume that autonomous cars are not safe as a result of what happened? No. And I think that's basically what I would say for agentic orchestration as well. There are going to be some bad incidents. One of my attributes, I was talking to you about this in the context of why does AI governance even matter in the grand scheme of things? And I was basically looking at it, if you go sequentially from traditional systems all the way down to like world models that can think about counterfactual scenario modeling, there are two things that I always talk about. They're related to each other. One is around error visibility. Error visibility is, can you spot a problem when it happens quickly? And traditional systems typically tend to be pretty obvious. And it's trying to create an invoice and it then actually create the invoice, or it basically blasted one invoice, but it's doing one invoice at a time. That's not a problem. The other problem is what I call the blast radius, which is how consequential is this problem as a result of what happened. And I think as you start weighing in some of these things, you have to understand that this one mistake can be highly consequential, should have never happened. And hence, you got to constrain how agents work. But if the error was benign, for example, if you basically wrote an algorithm to spot a pothole and it did not actually spot the pothole. My question is, so what? It was like a really small pothole or like a huge pothole and it always spots the huge pothole, but not the small one. Yes, it made a mistake. It, it sped the car through. Is that a problem? No, right? I think you have to look at these problems in the consequence of how consequential it is, how frequently does it happen, and then use that as your gauge for should I or should I not use it for the scenario. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And it's actually, I have something I want to follow up with this on, right? Because you're right. I mean, once it messes up, there's a judgment of it's just not good. And actually, I had a live session earlier today on LinkedIn where we talked a little bit about that, where it was, what is the misconception about AI? And it's like, if it doesn't work once, then it's not good. And there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work, right? It could be user expectations, it could be user input, right? Some input, obviously, if it's the wrong input, you're going to get the wrong output. If I wanted to make an image and I had a very vague prompt instruction, then don't expect a great quality in the way out. And so, I do wonder if, how much of, if we think about in terms of the industry, like what kind of impact all this will have in the long term, right? So if we were to use any example, like you said, let's say we have an edge case, you use the one with a car. If we use an edge case that it doesn't detect the wrong thing happening, but then you compare it to this one agent that looks over 100 of cameras, but you compare it to one person that can miss, dozens of incidents as they look across screens at, 20 cameras at a smaller sample size. It's interesting that humans pass that kind of judgment on to these sorts of things, right? Even though that they work really great. And so really, really my question comes down to, do you believe in a lot of the benchmarks that they're contrasting the models to? Like, so whether it's like humanity's last exam or anything else that exists, and do you think that's something that people can look at and then pass judgment based on what it's great at? So meaning that maybe it crushes STEM and math. And so if it does give a simple math question wrong, I can then judge it to say, well, it does not work, right? I don't know, right? So meaning that do you think that level of, if it passes the benchmark, that's enough to give it a baseline of whether I should judge it or not as a user?
It depends on the use case that you're looking at. Again, the security industry, we all agreed, it's very complex. And a lot of these benchmarks out there are guiding, but not necessarily your Bible for how you should use them, right? And I know there are some terrific benchmarks out there. The Helm, for example, is like a very good benchmark that we've all talked about in terms of how well these models react. But at the end of the day, my question is, you go to school, you go to an undergrad, you write a lot of exams, and you go to the corporate world and you start working. Are you ready in your corporate world on day one because you got an A on all of these exams? Probably not. If you use that as your guideline, I think people do hire students that have a better grade because it's an indicator of what it can do, but it's not guaranteed for success. I think it basically comes down to how well you mold that employee at that point in time. And I don't think AI is any different in the sense that it works well when you ask it how to make ice cream, but if you basically put it in an enterprise situation, not I'm not even talking public safety, I'm talking about any enterprise situation. These models are getting to a point where they have been reasonably commoditized. There are some models that are better than others. Don't get me wrong. Claude is pretty good at coding. Gemini is pretty good at reasoning with certain things. OpenAI is extremely good with deep search that I've seen when I've used it myself personally. I say rather than try and figure out which model is the best model that you should be using for all your use cases. Think about what is a model that do an A/B test, figure out which model works best for the problem that you're looking to solve, and then use it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's also around agent instructions and doing this specific format of instructions that that model calls for. And you can't just have redundant models if one goes down and think that the new one, when it picks back up, is going to consume the instructions the same. You're going to get completely different results. I learned that early on when we started the agency, and we had a fallback LLM if one of them stopped for whatever reason, and it did. The instructions, although pretty straightforward, thought it was fairly universal, finding out between Claude and OpenAI that they would ingest instructions quite differently. And so I do want to ask you something and skip a few questions ahead. You said a statement that I thought was pretty good, like kind of one liner, right? Where you talked about or you emphasize really top line efficiencies over bottom line deficiencies. I feel like that should be a bumper sticker. I'm going to add that to my website and like tag you in it, right? So when you emphasize that, can you explain the difference in plain language, let's say for security operators or people in the industry? What are the difference between top line efficiencies and bottom line deficiencies as far as those top being over bottom?
Yeah, I'll get to the security example in a moment, but let me basically back up over here and ask a there's a difference between cost takeout and driving efficiency for growth. You're doing the same thing. Let's pick sales and marketing, for example, sales operation, quote management, and you have an organization that's basically looking to double its growth, they double its revenue in the next 5 years, let's say 15% CAGR. And we understand that they cannot grow at the same cadence that they've been growing at in terms of the number of people. And technology has to do its part in order to drive that top line growth. And that's efficiency and productivity being delivered to drive the top line. You could use the same thing to drive your bottom line too, where you say, well, I don't know that I'm going to be growing at the pace that I want to. And hence I have to do what that's one example of talking about top line drivers versus bottom line. I'm a huge fan of using AI for top line growth. And the reason is because adoption becomes a lot easier from an organizational standpoint. Now, let's take this to a security example where you want to write up an incident, right? That's a bottom line efficiency problem, if you ask me, because but if you seriously think about it, yes, it does improve what the officer is doing to ensure that they can capture the information quickly. However, it also means that they can do value added work. They can probably spend more time with the community, for example, than writing reports. But I think that's what I would be talking about. So whenever I look at a problem, the first question that I ask is don't think about this as resource management and more efficient use of resources. Think about it as like a value driver. You're driving something else that would have not been possible before because this person was sitting down and spending time writing a report. Now, extend that a little further and you say, well, if I can take AI right up to the edge, and let's say I have a first responder situation within a school, like a first shooter situation, active shooter situation, not a first, active shooter situation, can I drive the capability with AI to ensure that people lock the door? So imagine this, right? I mean, how many people actually understand what needs to be done in a active shooter situation? How often do people experience and expecting
They prepare for it, but even when it happens, it's still not enough. It's shown in recent years. A lot of resource officers don't go to the same. Yeah.
even officers, you're absolutely right. Even officers are not fully equipped. They're better equipped, but they're not fully equipped to handle those kinds of situations because they don't see that all the time, fortunately. But when they do see it, they need to be able to act as efficiently as possible. But I think they would be the biggest benefactors if the rest of the school could actually follow the procedures quickly and then shut the doors down. Make sure that they don't have anyone with the windows. So imagine one of these teachers had a headphone in there, and then they were getting step by step instructions on exactly what to do, not looking at a notebook, not flipping pages, trying to figure out what to do, lock the door. The door's automatically locked. You told all the students to stay down, away from the windows. Boom. That's amazing, right? I mean, I call that like top line efficiency, and the reason is because it helped save lives.
Yeah. If we think about maybe less of, let's say, life safety and more of business productivity. Sometimes I do wonder that when people are freed up of all these repetitive tasks, and what I learned recently, Microsoft ran a study that 57% of people's time was actually in the coordination layer. They spent a lot of time emailing and meetings and follow ups and scheduling and back and forth and coordinating podcast episodes or something, right? And so like it doesn't stop. And so once people get that 57% of time back, I do wonder sometimes how many people will rise to the occasion to repurpose that time. Because the assumption is, and this is my business too, right? I mean, that's the narrative. It's like, hey, we give you your time back to do something else. But I wonder how much of that's going to be replaced. And obviously, I think that's a leadership problem to me. Then that's not like an AI problem. The people will decide what they do with their time, and leaders and companies will help move that. But I don't know if you've ever given that some thought and what you've seen on your consulting side where, okay, we're going to save all this time, but now we have another problem. What do we do with the extra time that people get back? And are actually they going to, now it's like jobs and roles start to adjust. Maybe they go from, a customer service rep that isn't doing repetitive amount, and some of them that are management capable, they get promoted and now they manage a series of agents. And now they're an agent manager. So I don't know if you've ever given that some thought around, how does roles evolve when people get their time back and top
I,
line
s-
efficiencies?
I say people are like atoms, right? We love our lowest energy state, generally speaking. I mean, given the choice, if I have some time, my tendency is to go watch some TV, not do some community service. Unless I have a specific trigger. My wife tends to be a little bit more community oriented, and so there are times where it's like, okay, you got some time back, why don't you come and help us out? So absolutely. So yeah, I mean, she's a leader in our home as well, right? As it turns out, so it's a leadership problem. You're absolutely right. So in terms of ensuring that people use their time efficiently, for example, if I get some time back, I could probably go and put some thought leadership into something else. And it's something that at Accenture we were specifically asked to do, which was to, well, can you go and mentor someone? Do you have the time to go sit down and then have a conversation, bring them up to speed? Can you go and build a new offering potentially? Can you go and look at a different target market? Are all things that I think some leaders tend to do automatically because they are not people that are couch potatoes sitting in one place. But I believe that's something that organizations need to start thinking about. Well, I've started deploying agents, and let's give this an interesting example. We say, well, marketing campaigns are run by agents now, and there's like one marketing manager that's ensuring that all of these things are being looked into, and there's a human in the loop. But as you scale the organization, you did not need as many people, but they were still doing all the right things. But their ways of working has fundamentally changed. Now, I believe you're probably going to have to start asking, how do I upskill these folks that used to do job X or a set of tasks over here to do a different set of tasks that are related to what they did? You're not going to ask people that were doing marketing to go and do customer service, probably not their area of interest. But there are related areas like product management that they could probably pivot into and help out over there because you need to build new products to market out. Again, you're right. It's an organizational problem where organizations are going to have to say, well, I'm going to have to actively reskill people into a new role. And good learning organizations do that continuously. It's not a specific trigger that makes them do it. They do it all the time.
Yeah, and I think too, it's not an overnight sweep of like, oh my gosh, this role completely changed. I mean, it's the leaders that take on the AI automation, and so that iterative change would then should cause some sort of effect. I would imagine around role change.
Mhm.
That's a discussion at the table. I'm sure you had when you're at Accenture about you're going to do this thing that's going to automate 30% of this staff. Now, what are they going to do? And what are you going to do about it? What are those discussions? What is those roles? Now let's talk about what those roles look like. And that way, before they even mention to say, hey, we're going to have this thing and it's going to make us more efficient. It's going to save you a lot of time. I think those people are thinking about, well, what does that mean for me? If it's going to do 30, I've actually had conversations with customers, super awkward actually, where we were building an agent that was going to do most of their work. And then they were on the phone without the leader and they were like, well, what am I going to do after this? I said, I wish I could answer that question for you, but that's not my question to answer. We're just the engineering arm, right? But I do think that I had to, speak up in the moment and just say, like, I think if you think about it this time, this is probably not work you wanted to do anyways,
Mm.
and this is going to allow you to rise to your potential, and no one really rises to lower expectations in life. And I think that it's not that anyone's person's fault. It's that when they get used to something and it becomes available, that unless they get pushed by someone, whether it's in a company or out of company, to do something different, to allow them to see their potential, they just never really realize it. And so when organizations make that change, it seems incumbent upon them to have an iterative approach as opposed to, okay, we're automated 20%. Now, what do we do with these people? I don't think it doesn't seem like there's any surprises, I assume, right?
No, you spot on. I'll give you another analogy over here. You should be used to this by now.
I like analogies. It helps.
When people write, their job is to write regulations, let's say, in the government. What do you think their incentive is? Write more regulations because that's what they've been trained to do. It's good for them, not good for the country because more regulations essentially means more red tape. More red tape potentially means that there's not enough trade happening and businesses are not growing. And I'm not against regulations. By the way, I just want to be very clear. I mean, the whole reason why public safety works as effectively as they do today in the US compared to other third world countries is because we have some good regulations out there. However, when people are incentivized to do one thing and they're not globally incentivized to do the right thing, then it becomes an organizational problem, and which is what we're suffering from today in the US. Let's just be honest about it. So, if you told them that their job was not to write regulations, but was to keep people safe in specific environments, I believe that they will potentially do slightly different things in order to get there. So, maybe you go from writing more regulations to driving more validations or audits, and a lot of different things can potentially happen. And it's related to what they do. They wrote the regulation, so they can probably go and test against it, right? And I think that's the way you have to start thinking about it in even in the private sector now, because private sector typically tends to be more incentivized, learning led than the government does. And I'm not knocking the government; I'm just basically stating a fact, right? But if you take manufacturing, for example, we were talking about production control and the role of a production control manager. What does your new role look like? And in fact, at Accenture, we basically looked at the entire gamut of roles that exist within manufacturing, all the way from production control to shipping the product out. So think like buy, build, buy, make, deliver, the entire gamut. And we looked at what these roles, future roles can potentially look like. And you were saying something that was very important, which I want to reiterate. People are going to start managing agents more than they're going to manage themselves and or the people that come under them. It's going to become very, very important for several reasons. The exact reason that I was talking about, like error visibility is an important problem, blast radius is an important problem. How do you ensure that you're getting the right outcomes? And they need to be trained to look for what call rather than starting with a question, they're starting with an answer now. And someone's got to go and validate the answers. I think the organizations need to recognize that and then ensure that these new roles are evident and people are being reskilled into doing what they need to do.
Yeah, I love this idea that I believe you're posing, which is um, with the advent of AI automation taking out portions of work for people, it allows the company to incentivize them in ways that's better for the organization or the country, as opposed to just sheer output. It's
Hmm.
like the output of the thing of writing could be democratized or something, but it's more about the incentive for them that drives their input to the output. And now the game changes. Their why of to say, hey, you're doing this for safety, to increase safety and regulation, and not just to write the regulations. And so maybe there's more thought into the regulation that just by way of the incentive change. So I love that. I want to talk more about these top line signals for AI agents. And so I'll give you an example, right? So we're currently building we have actually an agent beta for customer success. And that one, when originally we're building it, we're looking at signals that we can measure, like number of tickets created, number of leads generated, number of customer conversations, latency, things like this, number of human escalations, things that were, completely objective that we can measure the inputs of data. And that's good. But I think in terms of what business owners would prefer is information about churn and information about growth. And so going into what meaningful top line signals, even though I could say, wow, an agent generated 30 tickets today. How much time would that have normally taken? Right. And we can make that estimate. But what I heard from some folks early stage of building this is that maybe people are less concerned about saving on labor and more concerned about how they're creating the best customer experience in this example and how they are increasing their business in ways they couldn't have done without it. And so I'm kind of leading you a little bit on that one, but mostly what I'm trying to figure out is from your perspective, around what are the most meaningful top line signals that an AI agent is creating real value at scale.
Yeah. The answer is, unfortunately, I'm going to start with this. It depends on the problem that you're looking to solve. So let's take the customer success problem that you were talking about. We all know the concept of everyone says land and expand, and it basically kills me when I hear land and expand because a layer model is actually land, adopt, expand, renew. And if you think about where customer success is, they basically focus on the adopt, expand, and renew. They have a role to play. And customer success is purely a top line growth generation problem statement, right? So some of the things that they need, if you think about the help that customer success leads need when they go and do a QBR, they want to explain to a customer why the adoption rates have been low. Is it a people, process, or a technology problem? How do you go and figure that out? Is probably a good way to think about it. Technology is typically your product. Process is I have something, but nobody seems to be following it. People problem typically tends to be out of the 30 people that do the job, five of them don't use it correctly. So if you can start doing these kinds of analytics, and again, these don't need to be, everything doesn't need to be agentic orchestration or generative AI, but these are simple analytics that you could possibly do with the data that you're getting. And that should act as your starting point for saying, well, this is probably going to cause an adoption issue. The adoption issue causes an expansion problem. The expansion problem causes a renewal issue because expansion is typically what causes customer stickiness. So rather than count the number of tickets that you generated, I would look at what has the agent done in order to ensure that it's been giving good insights and that's been driving. And I think these are indirect measures. Unfortunately, there's not a direct measure to what agentic orchestration did to top line growth. But I think there are some good indirect methodologies to potentially measure that and then say, okay, I did X, it led to Y, and what are my leading KPIs that I want to be looking at? What are the trailing KPIs that I want to be looking at? It's probably a way to think about it. But if you take this to a problem, to a supply chain issue, then you're looking at a completely different set of problem statements. You're looking at promise dates versus actual deliverables. You're looking at cost of delivery. You're looking at COGS. There are several other aspects that you have to start looking at. That's fundamentally different than what customer success teams are looking for, right? So there's still a top line aspect to it. There's still a bottom line aspect to it, but the way you measure them and the kind of KPIs that you look at will be different. The business teams know that. They should know that at least. Yeah, that's what they should be measuring against.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like this idea of proof of value, there's a little line out, it's out of line of questioning, but the speed of seeing value um, is probably, and also the size of the value is somehow all of it's related to the size of what I'm trying to solve or the problem, right? So like if it's a big problem, maybe it's longer time to see value. The value can be much bigger. And that spectrum to me starts with, and I don't know if you've used these terms, I've used them several times, but I think you'll know what I say when I mean this, is that, we're really moving into this era. We're kind of already there right now with these horizontal task-based agents that people can make themselves through natural language, and you can start to automate the little things that bog you down. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have vertical vertical functional agents. So vertical meaning that is niche based, could be supply chain, logistics, maybe even a sub industry for that, right? And then it's functional because it replaces a function percentage of a function of a business. And even a 5% replacement could be massive, right? For some companies, even two, right? Whatever, right? But some percentage, and not necessarily for an individual. And so when I think of this POV thought, that proof of value, that yes, I can get faster proof here, but the value is lower. And I find that maybe there's I hope that there'll be much more personal exploration for people. That's what we encourage in our agencies is they start tinkering, playing around, mess with some of the automation tools. There's free templates out there you can play around with just to get to know the kind of the DNA of the makeup of these things and separate the hype versus the reality. But then on this other side, you've got these vertical functional agents that can deliver massive top line value. And there's no reason why a single agent, whether it's an agent orchestration or agentic AI, can be worth six plus figures a year. No reason at all, right? Especially because I know you've seen it get pretty complicated, and we have too. One agent that looks like a product agent could be a makeup of 40 different sub agents, sub agent orchestration. And so, anyway, so my question is thinking about that spectrum, right, from personal, let's call it horizontal task based, all the way to vertical functional agents. When we think about this topic of this proof of value, do you agree with this, or do you see it maybe slightly differently? I'd love to get your thoughts and perspectives around this.
I see it a little differently, not by much though, a little. I think there's a general notion today that agents or generic agents that get created are like Office 365. You got Word, everybody gets to use Word. It's self service. Once it's installed, you get to go and write your own documents. I don't believe agents today are at that point where there is a co-authoring agent, for example, that's out there. It's very generic. It does not have the tone that your organization needs. There are and it might not be able to write marketing needs are different than product needs. Product needs typically tend to be more grounded, step by step. This is how you troubleshoot a document. This is the user manual versus a marketing which tends to be more aspirational in nature. So when I think about some of these horizontal agents, yes, they probably give you a catalyst to start working with, but they're not quite there in terms of what they can do today. It's just the way things are, right? It's not any different than you have PowerPoint, but if you don't have some templates on how you basically use it in your specific organization, it still is just going to be some hodgepodge of things that you can do. You get some incremental benefits out of it. But to step back and ask is better question. And I love the way you kind of called it out. So I'm going to reiterate something. So we've been thinking at Harting right now, the thought process has been, this is very, very, very new. This is week two at that place for me. So, I put that disclaimer out there. But we said, let's start with reducing toil. There are going to be some specific surgical problems that you want to go after and then solve for. Think of it as like table stakes, see bets that you can solve for because you can put an agentic orchestration in place to make that happen. But when I say agentic orchestration, I'm talking about true agentic orchestration, like the super agency orchestration agents and the utility agents all coming together in a structure, right? I don't think Copilot offers that, but they call it an agent. Won't go there. The second portion of it is simplify your process. Make it easy for agents to actually do the job. And you will see several times, Don, where I've seen there's a process for pricing disputes. So I think the fundamental question that you should be asking is like, why do you get into a pricing dispute in the first place if your pricing was clear? You should never have that problem in the first place. So if you can basically shift left and then ensure that your process actually is designed, and this is not just an AI problem, we don't want to throw the hammer onto everything. It's a clear redefinition of the process that AI can actually help solve for, then that's simplifying your process. And I think the third dimension or horizon that I generally have been talking about now is redefine your question. What is it that you're solving for? We talked about regulations a little while back. People that write regulations are incentivized to write regulations. I think the better question to ask is, again, I'm going to reuse something because I love the way you said it. We need to shift from outputs to outcomes. And rethinking outcomes is a fundamentally different task. It's a complicated task as well because you got to go through a lot of political battle to get there. So if you can make it that far, I think that's probably the holy grail in terms of how AI can truly reform how you go about doing things. Again, I'll give you an example of how I've been thinking about it. I've been having this sparring with a good friend of mine. Payroll systems, as we know it, pay you bi-weekly or monthly or semi-monthly. But there are those emails that you potentially get from your manager for basically doing that diving cash, solving that customer problem, and you did a phenomenal job. Put time until like 3 o'clock in the morning to get it out of the way, right? Kudos. They get specifically incentivized for it? Probably not, right? So I think there's got to be some instant karma that needs to come through. And then if you start thinking about how do you keep your employees engaged so they're heavily outcome driven, but make sure that they are sustained in your organization. So they you don't want to have bad practices where someone starts doing things in a way that's not in the best interest of the organization, and you don't want to basically tank your profits. So I think there are some guardrails that you still have to put in place, but I think you have to rethink what is it that you're actually solving for. Well, people are getting paid for a reason, and people are getting paid for outcomes, not for outputs anymore. And I think if you start taking that kind of a notion, I think AI can truly help you get there. But you got to go through steps one and two first.
Yeah, man. Well, I had a different question for you, and now I have a new one based on what you said, because I think we connected on outcome based pricing in a thread. And so, if humans need to start thinking not outputs but outcomes, I suspect agents do too. And I know that's about the outcome based pricing. Is that I wonder what's so wrong. So put it on maybe a different hat, because we can say what's so right about an outcome based pricing model. Like meaning like I use the example of these sales agents, which I don't know that has worked out that great, but that I put out a post where it was like, hey, if the sales agent really can turn around that many leads, like, wouldn't these companies want to give you an option to buy into an outcome based pricing model to be like, dude, if we can generate 20 leads for you in a week or 200 leads in a week, we'll charge you $500 a lead or $300 a lead, right? Land it in your lap, right? If it's that good, but nobody does. They do it on a subscription based model or usage based model, and but there certainly are agents that could do outcome based pricing, even if we talked about in terms of not a data review of what's my customer churn or what's my growth look like. It could just be saying like, wow, what would it cost me to run a ticket normally if I have someone that is $20 an hour, $25 an hour, and they're with that customer for 20 minutes on the phone, and I can evaluate the amount of customer interaction that the agent would have, and then come down to some simple math and say what the cost of the ticket is, and go ahead and make an evaluation and say, okay, for every ticket we create, we're going to charge you $1 or $2. So instead of we're just going to charge you a monthly subscription plus usage. But I think getting there, I'd imagine that the agent has to for the company to take a bet on that, has to very much be able to prove and believe that it works. And so I know there's a lot of argument to say like, okay, that could be a good idea if agents are as good as people say for any particular use case. But why do you think that outcome based pricing isn't a good idea? Do you have any general thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's risk. That's the one word.
Maybe, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
risk is the word, and I'll explain it. And in fact, we've actually talked about this several times, even at Accenture, where we say, why can't we do value based pricing? We go to a company and then tell them we're going to save you $300 million over a 5 year period, and you're going to pay us $50 million to do that. Or you know what? Doesn't even matter how much you pay us. We're going to take the risk in terms of building this capability for you, and you're going to give us a cut of whatever your savings are. Sounds easy on paper. The problem is not so much even in the execution, but in the belief system that the solution that you built, and this is not even AI, this could be anything, actually delivered that value. Now, what if that company came back and said, it's not your product that actually made it better? We went and made some process changes on our side. What do you do then? So you see the number of parameters that actually happen. And this is not actually something that I was thinking. This is it's a managing director of mine that actually explained why we are very averse to outcome based pricing. This is why. And yes, you can start with a hypothesis. You can tell them this is what we are going to do, and we are going to charge you X. We are going to give you Y. And if we don't give you Y and we give you less than Y, there's a penalty associated with it. And we put all of those things in place. But you need to then take control of a lot more of that organization. You can't just basically be taking stock of just their technology. You have to have control over their people, have access over their control over their process and their technology, all of it. And that's a huge, steep mountain to climb. So that's typically where outcome based pricing fundamentally fails. I love it, but you have to have a hypothesis around it, and then you have to build your pricing model in a way that aligns well to that value, and then you have to prove it subsequently.
Yeah, what I've heard too, and I'll make this statement and go on to the next question. But what I've heard too is that maybe a CFO would get very uneasy about costs they can't control to say, like, yeah, okay, we could sign up for that deal. And it's a gamble because, wow, you guys really believe in your thing to just charge for outcome based pricing when you deliver. And it's kind of like even on a basic level, how NAN, which is a low code automation tool works, right? Where it just charges you for the executed workflow and not for every step like other automation tools like Zapier or Make.com might do. Every step along the way, it just charges you when it's done,
Mhm.
which most people would want, right? Like don't come like if I had a guy working on something in my house and he halfway finishes the job and he's like, okay, I'm going to invoice you. I'm like, no, dude, you didn't finish the work. I don't want to get an invoice until you're done. Right. Or at least you can do 50 up front, 50 at the end, depending on the size of the job or the work, but never like you just leave when it's not done and then expect me to pay the invoice. So anyways,
Yeah,
so
it's like
that's
building
a
a.
little
It's,
bit of
it's
answer about
basically
that.
like building a bridge, and you contracted someone to build a bridge, and they basically built half the bridge for you, and then they said, "Well, you can fall right into the river now. Great, right? But pay me half for building you half the bridge, right?"
Right. Yeah, people are going to do that.
Yep.
So I have one more question for you because I know we're at time, but I really want to get this one out to you. It's about evals. So I've heard about evals, all an observability layer, whatever. That from some people in the AI community, that's actually harder to build than the actual agent by some degree of magnitude. And so whether that's true or not, that's not really the question. But I start off with that because when we think about evaluation strategy, around the next question. So why is having a clear evaluation strategy such a big deal? And what happens when teams skip formal evals altogether?
I'll give you an example, and I think probably a great way to end this conversation as well. So, test strategy is not new; it's always been there, and you always say, well, when you write take a test-driven approach to building products. It's called TDDs, right? The overarching idea is that you're basically building a product with certain specs that can be validated before you ship it out. And a good test-driven development is not looking for the sunny day scenarios alone; they're also looking for exception scenarios. Now, take that into the context of AI. And we were doing a design validation project with a client. Standards on one side, design on the other side. We need to validate them. The question that I was asking the test architect or the lead architect was, how much documentation do you need in order to ensure that this is statistically relevant? Now, you see, the question has shifted from just talking sunny day scenarios and exception scenarios to statistically relevant outputs because there's only so much that you can do. But this was more of a that the design actually passed muster out of these 20 plus checks that we were trying to look for mechanical checks, right? It's relatively straightforward to do that, but we needed to make sure we ran through the same document again and again. We wanted to make sure that it was giving us the same answer. So it's not just running it once anymore, it's running it several times and ensuring that the answer was consistent. Because remember, we're talking binary answers over here. And two, how many different versions of these documents can you potentially have? This is all unstructured data at this point in time. The standards are one form, but how many design documents do I potentially need in order to look at what these answers might be? And when you think about a data center and the fact that they can be built in several different ways, it might be an expansion of an existing data center, it could be a brand new data center, liquid cooled, air cooled. Think about all of these different scenarios that you basically hit yourself with. And sometimes they might not even have enough design documents to validate against. So now how do you ensure that you have the right documents built? So do you have to go and handwrite them? I think these tend to become very realistic, and I think that's one of the reasons why evals need to start in a certain way. But that's a simple scenario. Now take this to the marketing example that I was talking to you about. Three different runs can give you the three different answers potentially. And your job is not to say whether it was right or wrong. You have to say whether all three of them are acceptable, right? Now you're basically thinking about range-based testing. It's not a binary yes or no, right? So I think that's why evals become important. The strategy around evals become even more important. You have to think about statistical significance. You have to have a human in the loop that's validating some of these results and being comfortable about the fact that it is going to do the right thing. Can it do something bad? Yeah. But then evals need to happen in runtime as well. So you're not just going to let things run through because you've built a prototype doesn't necessarily mean that you're not doing a heatsink type of a test on some of your semiconductor chips. You continue doing that at a certain sample. at a certain sample rate. That's how you need to start thinking about evals moving forward. There's a initial plan that you have to have, and it needs to solve for a certain set of problems. I'm not going to get technical over here, but we can probably get super technical on what it needs to look like. And then what does it need to look like in runtime as well? Serves your reinforcement learning and some of those other concepts, the feedback loop that we were talking about is what it needs to solve for.
Got it. Awesome. Harish, this has been incredible. Honestly, we didn't even get through a lot of the questions. I had to skip through the ones that I was most interested in, to be honest, to fill in the time. And enlightening your gift to the industry. And I wanted to love to see more people like you. So if you know more people that like to have a chat, send them my way. And yeah, just want to say thanks, and I hope to see you around at the next event.
Oh, thank you, Don. And then we'll be in touch. But thank you for this opportunity. It was enlightening conversation for me. So I was hoping this wouldn't be a one-way conversation where I was talking to you like in a monologue, but I think the conversation back and forth was phenomenal. So I loved it. Thanks for the opportunity, and we'll stay in touch.